During my recent AnneBoleyn Q&A live streams on YouTube, I received a couple of questions about a portrait that Alison Weir has posted about recently on her author Facebook page. In her post, Alison Weir shares a photo of an image from the Royal Collection, which they describe as a hand-coloured lithograph of Joanna Neville, Lady Bergavenny. Weir explains that she first suggested Anne Boleyn as a sitter back in 2016, and now that she's seen the original portrait, which shows the sitter's high status dress and the initials BAR, which she believes stand for Anne Boleyn Regina, she thinks that a good case can be made for identifying the sitter as Anne Boleyn. I don't agree one iota, and I said in my live streams that I actually would dig out my research on this and dig out the article that I did back in 2016. I wrote a very detailed article on the AnneBoleynFiles.com on this image, and this video is based on that article. And I'll give you a link to that article in the description, as it has lots of references in it that you might want to check out. But let me tell you about this image of Lady Bergavenny. And here it is, courtesy of the British Museum. Back in 2016, this image went viral when a man named Howard Jones listed some photos of a print that he owned for sale on eBay. The listing title was Photo of a Print, Anne Boleyn Portrait from the Holbein Room at Strawberry Hill. And in the description he wrote, Walpole's Tudor painting had been incorrectly identified as Lady Joanna Bergavenny, who died before 1505. The initial A on the necklace, the two additional initials and other clues suggest this is a new and one of the best surviving portraits of Queen Anne Boleyn. An engraving of Walpole's painting had earlier been made in 1798. This is a later, more detailed copy made after the Strawberry Hill sale of 1842. Additional information regarding this identification and the provenance of the Tudor painting by or after Holbein ? Will be sent with the photograph. Now, I purchased a photo from Howard Jones on eBay at the time at £50 plus £9 postage to Spain. Yes, £50. And it wasn't even a photo of the complete image. I forked out that silly amount of money as I was curious. Here's the photo I received. So that's how big it is, and it's very much cut off and hasn't got the details of the actual original. I also received, the additional information I received was a letter from Mr. Jones with not a lot of information. And I think he also sent me this because I can't figure out where else I would have got it from. A photocopy of an article about it when it went viral, which I'll be mentioning in a bit. That's a scan of that photo that I received. I also began corresponding with Mr. Jones regarding his print. Mr. Jones told me that the re-identification of the print from Joan or Joanna née Fitzalan, wife of George Neville, Baron Bergavenny, was his own, and that it was based on the letters of the necklace being A, B and R, which he took to stand for Anne, Boleyn and Rochford. He also said that the British Museum print room told him it was a Victorian fake of Anne Boleyn. The information he sent with the photo stated that the original portrait was known as Lady Bergavenny, that it was given to Horace Walpole by Lady Beauclerk, daughter of the Duke of Marlborough, that it used to hang in the Holbein Rooms at Strawberry Hill, that the sitter's necklace had three initials, A, B and R, that there's a figure of 8 on the necklace and a swelling on the sitter's neck, and that the sitter has almond-shaped eyes, and that the sitter's facial features match other portraits of Anne Boleyn, such as the Radcliffe portrait, Hever Rose portrait, and the National Portrait Gallery engraving by Robert White, as seen here. None of this convinced me, but historian and author Alison Weir was convinced and posted about the image on her Facebook page. The Sunday Times, that article I mentioned, then got hold of the story and quoted Alison Weir as saying that the original portrait may have been painted to mark Anne Boleyn's coronation in 1533. Weir went on to explain that the A, B and R stood for Anne, Boleyn and Regina, Regina meaning queen. The article also stated that Weir thinks the carnation held by the sitter in the engraving is also significant. The flower symbolises love and may derive from the word coronation. Also quoted Weir as saying, putting all this together, and it does look as though this may be a portrait of Anne Boleyn painted to mark her marriage and coronation. Tracy Borman, Joint Chief Curator for the Historic Royal Palaces, said that she was also very convinced. Soon after this went viral, the prices of Jones's photos of his print, and that's what you got, started creeping up on eBay. £70 at one point for a photo of a black and white engraving, and not all of the engraving. Then he started listing prints of his print at £1,000 each, and I think one even went up to 1,200 if I remember rightly. I became very concerned about this. I'd already started researching the image, but now my anger and frustration at this caused me to go crazy researching it. Yes, I lived and breathed that image for a good few weeks. Now, I'm not an art historian or an expert on Tudor dress. So I contacted experts, and I also contacted the British Museum, the print room at the British Museum, regarding Howard Jones's claim that the British Museum print room had told him it was a Victorian fake of Anne Boleyn. Hugo Chapman, the Simon Sainsbury keeper of prints and drawings, didn't know anything about Jones's claims and said that they'd got 2 prints after the Walpole portrait and they are identified as Bergavenny. The museum also stated, "We stand by the identification given on the database of the 2 prints." I kept in touch with Mr. Jones too. Our email's quite amusing really, because I'm very polite, but I'm totally against anything he says. And I kept asking him what he knew about the provenance of the print and portrait. He told me, the provenance question is silly. Well, anyone who's watched Fake and Fortune on TV knows that provenance is key, not only in determining the value of a piece of art, but also in identifying the artist or the sitter. From my research on the image, Mr. Jones's print was one of several based on a painting which, as Jones states, was given to Horace Walpole, 4th Earl of Orford, by Lady Diana Beauclerk, née Spencer, 1734 to 1808. She was the daughter of Charles Spencer, 3rd Duke of Marlborough. Diana was a maid of honour to Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, and she was an artist. I haven't been able to find yet how Diana got hold of it, and I still haven't found out. In a description of the villa of Mr. Horace Walpole, youngest son of Sir Robert Walpole, Earl of Orford, at Strawberry Hill near Twickenham, Middlesex, with an inventory of the furniture, pictures, curiosities, etc., 1784, I found a mention of the painting in the More Editions section, which described it as Joanna Lady Abergavenny, Bede, Royal and Noble Authors, a present from Miss Beauclerk, the Maid of Honour. This was a reference to a Walpole's book, Royal and Noble Authors, in which he included Joan Lady Bergavenny as an authoress of prayers, which was a mistake as he meant Frances, wife of Henry Lord Bergavenny. The Lewis Walpole Library, Yale University, states that the portrait was kept in the Holbein chamber of Strawberry Hill and that in 1774 its description was unidentified. But in 1784 its description became Joanna Lady Abergavenny, or Bergavenny. In 1842, Walpole's Strawberry Hill collection was sold by his heirs, dispersing thousands of paintings, drawings, prints, pieces of furniture, books, manuscripts, ceramics, etc., around the world. In the sale catalogue is a description of the painting given by Lady Diana Beauclerk to Walpole. This is a pleasing portrait of a woman in middle life, handsomely attired in the costume of Henry VIII's reign and holding a flower. The network of her headdress is filled with the letters I, note I was used for J too, and A, the initials of her maiden name in alternate rows. And she wears a splendid necklace which has an A in the centre and at each side a B standing for Bergavenny, as the title was then written. The Lewis Walpole Library, Yale University state what happened to it at the sale. Provenance, gift of Lady Diana Beauclerk to Horace Walpole, 1842, Strawberry Hill, London sale, day 20, lot 76, sold. Now, it says that it was sold to Jarman. Now, this could be John Jarman, a London dealer of curiosities. It passed from Jarman on to someone called Ralph Burnell and was listed in a catalogue as the celebrated Lady Joanna Abergavenny in a crimson dress with yellow sleeves, a gold headdress, embroidered jewelled girdle ornament her dress. She holds a pink in her left hand in a tortoiseshell frame, half length, 16 inches by 12 inches. I've been unable to trace its whereabouts after that, but art historian Dr. Bendor Grosvenor states in his blog post on the subject that it's not lost and that he's seen a colour photograph of it. And obviously Alison Weir is now saying that she's seen the original. Grosvenor was asked to look into whether it might be Anne Boleyn, and he explains, our belief at the time was the sitter was most likely not Anne Boleyn, though the tedious thing is I can't now remember all of our conclusions. There was nothing in the way of provenance or traditional identification to lead us down that path. As far as I recall, there was no matching necklace in any Royal Tudor jewellery inventory. But I do remember paying attention to the other motifs in the headdress and not being able to connect any of them to Anne Boleyn. There are several prints based on the portrait, and here are 4 of them. And then there's this beautiful watercolour too. They are all very different in style, in the appearance of the sitter, and also the detail shown in them. I think they actually tell us more about the era in which they were produced than the portrait that they were based on. One interesting difference between the portraits and prints is the necklaces, with some not showing the letters, and the later versions having the letters A, B and R rather than just the A and 2 Bs described as being on the necklace in the original portrait. Mr. Jones explained to me that there were clues in the print that pointed to Anne Boleyn as the sitter. I assume he was referring to the letters, which he took to mean Anne Boleyn and Rochford, and that Weir takes for Anne Boleyn and Regina, and the gillyflower, also known as a pink or carnation. Let's take the flower first. Flowers, plants and trees in medieval times and Renaissance art were definitely used as symbols. Think back to Ophelia in Act 4, Scene 5 of Shakespeare's Hamlet, where she says, "There's rosemary, that's for remembrance. Pray you, love, remember. And there is pansies, that's for thoughts." In the garden of the Renaissance botanical symbolism in Italian painting, Mirella Levi d'Ancona, and I've probably said her name completely wrong, writes, according to custom spread from the Netherlands, the carnation or its variation, the pink, was worn by the bride on the day of her wedding, and the groom was supposed to search her and find the pink. For this reason, the pink or the carnation became a symbol of marriage and were often shown in pictures of newlyweds or betrothed. In the description of this 16th century painting known as a young man holding a carnation, the Victoria and Albert Museum state, "Carnations or pinks, especially when red, were symbols of betrothal, probably originating in a Flemish wedding custom. In portrait paintings, especially of the 15th and 16th centuries, when held in the sitter's hand, it signifies betrothal." A similar earlier example of the Italian type is Andrea Celario's Man with a Pink, circa 1495, London National Gallery. According to an article, Symbols and Meanings in Medieval Plants, gillyflowers are also associated with springing from the Virgin's tears and therefore presage the Passion of Christ. The Virgin of the Pinks depicts Christ holding them in his hand. Still another source, Flower Meanings A to Z, gives the following meanings. Red carnation, my heart aches for you and admiration. White carnation, innocence, love and devotion. Pink carnation, I'll never forget you. Yellow carnation, you disappoint me, rejection. In this Anglo-Flemish portrait of Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, Arthur is depicted holding a similar flower. This portrait was discovered in the early 1990s and is by an anonymous member of the Anglo-Flemish school. Dendrochronology supports the idea that this was painted at the time of Prince Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Van Eyck's painting of circa 1436 of a man holding a pink was also probably painted to celebrate a forthcoming marriage, which demonstrates the visual trope of using a pink as a symbol of marriage. The only thing that I found about these flowers being linked to coronations is an article on carnations on Wikipedia, which says some scholars believe that the name carnation comes from coronation or corone, flower garlands, as it was one of the flowers used in Greek ceremonial crowns. Others think the name stems from the Latin caro, genitive carnis, flesh, which refers to the original colour of the flower, or incarnatio, incarnation, which refers to the incarnation of God made flesh. Perhaps the name does come from corone, but I haven't found any 16th century link between the flower and coronations. Let's move on to the letters. As has been pointed out, the sitter shown in Mr. Jones's print is wearing a necklace with a central A and then a B and an R. Here is a zoomed in image of the necklace. I know from my own research into Anne's jewellery that a list of certain jewels of the King's Highness which be trussed and enclosed within a fair desk of wood included rings and jewels with HA on them, a ring engraved with MOSTE, most, Anne's motto was the most happy, and a brooch with RA in diamonds for Regina Anna. There were also rings with HI for Henry and Jane, an I being used in that period for a J too. It was fashionable in Henry VIII's reign to use letters or ciphers in jewellery, and Henry also made use of them in buildings. We know that Hans Holbein designed a number of pieces of jewellery and ciphers with letters entwined. In the 15th century, Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, was painted with a bee pendant, very similar to the bee of Anne Boleyn's famous bee necklace, attached to her headdress, so they were fashionable then too, and obviously B was for Burgundy. However, letters did not have to be related to the person's name. As historian and costume expert Bess Chilver pointed out in a Facebook comment in 2016 to people saying things like, oh, it must be Anne because of the A and B, letters in pre-Reformation England could have religious significance and could be abbreviations for Latin phrases relating to Christ, such as the IHS that Jane Seymour is depicted as wearing in her portrait. The IHS monogram refers to the holy name of Jesus. An intertwined A&M could be used as a monogram of the Virgin Mary with Auspice Maria, meaning under the protection of Mary. As Bess notes, an A on its own could refer to Alpha, for all we know. While Anne Boleyn could make use of an R after her marriage to Henry VIII, when she was Anna Regina, she couldn't have made use of an R in the early 1520s, which is when this costume dates to. More on that in a few minutes. Her father may have become Viscount Rochford in 1525, But Anne was not entitled to use the title of Lady Rochford then, as only the daughters of dukes, earls and marquises could style themselves as lady. Only from December 1529, when her father was made Earl of Wiltshire, could Anne call herself Lady Rochford. Bess explains that Thomas Boleyn's elevation to Earl allows his daughter Anne to be styled Lady Anne Rochford, as she takes the surname from his secondary title of Viscount Rochford. His son George is styled by that secondary title, so becomes Viscount Rochford. But the letter R isn't even in the original portrait, according to descriptions. The description of the original portrait says that the sitter wears a splendid necklace which has an A in the centre and at each side a B standing for Bergaveni. So let's forget about the R. But what about the A and B's? Surely they scream Anne Boleyn. Well, no, they could be anything. A for Arundel, the title of Joan's father who held that earldom. B for Bergaveni, Joan's husband's title. They don't have to be Anne Boleyn. And what about the I's or J's and A's on the hood, which you see here? Why would Anne Boleyn use an I or a J? The costume clinches it for me, though. My friend Bess Chilver is a historian, costume expert and reenactor, and she is my go-to for information on 16th century costume. Back in 2016, I contacted her about Mr. Jones's print for advice on dating the costume. Bess also discussed the costume of the sitter with other costume experts and was able to date the costume of the sitter to between 1520 and 1525. And stated that the costume was of a wealthy and high status lady. What is the evidence for this? Let me explain. Firstly, there's the shape and style of the English gable hood that the sitter wears. Now, this dates to the early 1520s. The gable hood evolved over time, just like the French hood did. In the prints, the lappets, the bands hanging down at the side of the hood, which you can see here, you can see that they almost brush the shoulder. By the 1530s, as you can see on this detail from the Holbein portrait of Jane Seymour and in the 1534 Anne Boleyn medal, these were much, much shorter. Secondly, there's the neckline. The sitter's dress has a much narrower square to its neckline than the wider neckline Anne is wearing in the 1534 medal and which was fashionable in the 1530s. If you consider the National Portrait Gallery portrait of Anne Boleyn, which dates to her daughter's reign but is of 1530s dress, you can see that the neckline is so wide that it's almost off the shoulder. Thirdly, the white bands. In the prints, the sitter has a band of white fabric coming down over each shoulder and ending just below the bust. These bands were fashionable in the 1520s but had disappeared by the 1530s. Anne is not shown wearing them on the 1534 medal, Jane Seymour doesn't wear them in her portrait, and Catherine of Aragon starts to lose them in the late 1520s, early 1530s. If the print is a coronation portrait, as Alison Weir states, then Anne Boleyn is extremely unfashionable. She is wearing fashion that is about 10 years out of date. Would a queen allow herself to be depicted wearing out-of-date clothes? I don't believe so. She would have the wealth and status to be up to date, and she'd be setting the fashion. But could it be a 1520s image of Anne? Well, that doesn't make sense either, unfortunately. Bess points out that the sitter's costume with all the embroidery on the hood and her display of jewellery shows that not only is the sitter wealthy, but she is also of high status. In the early 1520s, Anne Boleyn was not high status. She didn't become a marchioness until September 1532. But wasn't her father a king's favourite and a wealthy man in the 1520s? Well, yes. But his daughter just didn't have the status to be painted in this way. Bess explained this really well on Facebook, so I'll quote her words. There were many people who were wealthy. The first millionaire lived in Lavenham and was a merchant of wool, though he too was also knighted. However, what then comes into play is something called sumptuary laws. These were strict and were designed to ensure that people dressed according to their status in life. A gentlewoman, daughter of a mere knight, does not dress as if she's a duchess. It would be insulting to those at court. Thomas Boleyn, though he may be wealthy, is still not in a position to rock that particular boat even in the 1520s. Dressing his daughters to rival the Queen at the time is not one he's going to risk. As a maid of honour, not lady-in-waiting, the girls would also have been expected to dress to a specific standard and not step over that line to be better dressed than others who are higher ranking than they are. It was one thing to be spoken of as one who stands out due to the cut of the dress, and did have more French-styled gowns, but it would have been a completely different thing to have been spoken of because one is dripping in jewels and fabrics that are above one's station in life. Then there's the age of the sitter. We don't know Anne Boleyn's exact birth date, but historians believe that she was born in the first decade of the 16th century, with 1501 and 1507 being the dates argued. I'm a 1501 person. As we've established through dating the costume, if the missing portrait is contemporary, then it was painted in the early 1520s. Anne returned to England from France in late 1521 or early 1522, when she was either about 2021 or 1415. At this time, she was a young woman in her prime, not a woman in middle life, which is how the sitter of the original portrait was described in 1842. If we set aside the dating of the costume and go with Weir's idea of it being a coronation portrait, then Anne would have been about 32 or about 26. You might call that middle age for the Tudor period, but would Henry and Anne want Anne, the new queen, depicted as middle-aged? And if it is a coronation portrait, why is her pregnancy not obvious? I'm sure that 16th century costume could hide a pregnancy quite well, but Anne was 5 or 6 months pregnant in June 1533, and her pregnancy was a huge deal, with Henry believing that she was carrying his son and heir. So wouldn't a coronation portrait have celebrated that? Anne's coronation procession alluded to her pregnancy and fertility. Her falcon badge with the falcon on a tree stump from which white and red roses spilled, a pageant with St. Anne surrounded by her children, and the monarch's crown, the crown of St. Edward, was used at her coronation, which has been taken by some to signify that Anne's unborn child was actually being crowned too. So where are the allusions to pregnancy and fertility in this portrait? I stand by my conclusion of 2016 when I was emphatic that this image was not of Anne Boleyn. Art historian Bendel Grosvenor stated that there was nothing in his research, and he is an art historian and an authority, that linked it to Anne Boleyn. Grosvenor explained, the picture was once at Strawberry Hill, and we must be tempted to assume that if there really was any historical chance that this sitter might have been Anne Boleyn, then those old iconographical optimists of the 18th and 19th centuries would have labelled it as such. And I have to agree with him. We don't know what information came with the original portrait. Did it become known as Joanna Lady Bergaveny because of the letters alone, or was there a provenance that supported that identity? We don't know. The letters do fit that identification, the prominent A and B's for her family name Arundel and the title Bergaveny, and then the not so prominent I/J for Joanna or Joan. But then the costume dating might not point to Joanna, in that she's said to have died around 1508. But it could be a posthumous portrait though. In my opinion, there is not one good reason to re-identify this image as Anne Boleyn. The clues in the prints do not point to Anne Boleyn. The costume is wrong, the age of the sitter is wrong, the letters are wrong, the status of the sitter is wrong. If it's meant to be Anne Boleyn, then it's been painted much later by someone unaware of the costume of the period and the rules governing what people wore. I can't say it's definitely not Anne Boleyn. I don't have the portrait and I'm not a qualified art historian or Tudor portrait specialist. But my research and the expertise of those I've contacted regarding the print do not point to it being Anne. I think for now we're best to label this image Unknown Woman engraved as Joan, née Fitzalan, Lady Bergavenny, as the National Portrait Gallery have done with their print. The identity of the sitter just isn't known for sure, but it's someone who was of high status in the early 1520s. Further research into the original portrait is needed, and hopefully that can be done, and with a very open mind. Interestingly, in February of this year, I had an email from someone, and I won't name them, who thought they might actually own the original portrait. Unfortunately, after they'd taken it to Bonhams in London, they discovered that it wasn't original, and it was probably a copy made by Lady Beauclerk, the lady I mentioned earlier, who gave the portrait to Walpole. Apparently, she was known for making copies of paintings. I'm sure the portrait's still beautiful, though. I'll give you a link to art historian Bendel Grosvenor's post from 2016 on Howard Jones's print. He too does not agree with Alison Weir, writing that her blog post on the portrait displays some basic misunderstandings about Boleyn's iconography. I agree. I know we're all dying to find a contemporary portrait of Anne Boleyn, but I really don't think this is it. But I'd love to know what you think, so please do share your views in the comments. Take care, I'll see you soon.